This podcast is presented by Regions Bank. You're chasing your goals, and it's up to you how you want to get there. Let Regions Bank coach you with financial tips that fit your everyday grind. Visit regions.com/next-step to learn more. Regions, member FDIC.
Hello and welcome to the AP Top 25 College Football Podcast. I'm Ralph Russo, the college football writer with the Associated Press. My guest this week is Heather Dinich, ESPN's college football playoff reporter. We are taping before this week's rankings come out, so we're not reacting to the rankings as much as trying to see where the committee might be headed and playing out some scenarios. We'll also talk about Alabama's Tua Tagovailoa, not just in terms of what his injury means to the Crimson Tide's playoff hopes, but also about his legacy to Crimson Tide and college football. Heather and I will also get into the question of, do we miss great stories in college football because we tend to view everything through the lens of the playoff? Thanks for listening to the AP Top 25 College Football Podcast. You can find us on Westwood One Podcast, at Apple Podcasts, just about anywhere you like to get your podcast. Please subscribe, and if so inclined, give us a good review. It helps college football fans find us, and it helps us find more college football fans. And away we go. Welcome to the podcast this week, Heather Dinich, the playoff reporter for ESPN, the great playoff reporter, playoff guru, one might say, for ESPN. Thanks so much for joining me today, Heather. And just so everybody knows, I said it at the beginning in the opening, but I will say it again. We are recording this on Tuesday before the rankings come out. So we aren't reacting to the latest rankings, but then again, the latest rankings might not change all that much from the previous rankings, which is one of the reasons why I decided to have you on at this time of the day. So how are you, Heather?
I'm good, and I agree with you. As a matter of fact, I think the top 10 have the potential to stay status quo this week, which is kind of strange because everybody was panicking and asking questions and freaking out about the injury to Tua Tagovailoa, and deservedly so, but I don't think it changes things much, to be quite honest. Okay,
so let's just start there since you opened the door. Well, and I definitely want to talk about Tua on a couple of different levels. We are going to talk mostly playoff, but Tua is the news of college football right now. But let's start with the playoff aspect, because I think on Saturday when he goes down, it almost felt a little callous to talk about how this affects Alabama's playoff perspective, but we all had to do that. Even, we all had to sort of take a step back and say, okay, what does this mean in the big picture? And I am somewhat with you, at least as far as, and we'll find out tonight, but I don't know if it has any immediate impact, though I guess what could it mean if as Alabama plays other games, specifically not against Western Carolina, but against Auburn? Because people are starting to throw out the Cardale Jones, they did this with a third-string quarterback back in 2014, and that propelled Ohio State to a national championship. This is a very nuanced, and it's also not territory that the committee. Everything is always somewhat unique, this situation, to the committee. So, where do you think this could go with Tua, Alabama's playoff hopes, and does it really matter?
Well, I think it is a fair comparison to 2014 Ohio State, in that is how the selection committee will view it. When J.T. Barrett went down against Michigan with an ankle injury, that's the regular season finale, similar time of year, late November. What is the committee going to do? Same thing. What are they going to do? They're going to wait, just like they waited with Ohio State to see what Cardale Jones looked like. So in this case, they wait to see what Mac Jones looks like. Now, if they want to, of course, they could rewind and look at the Arkansas game film, but that's not necessarily a great evaluation because it's a 2-8 Arkansas team, right? They can see what happened in the second half. Mac Jones came in against Mississippi State. Is that a fair evaluation? Probably not, because he's coming in after what was a traumatic incident to the entire team, right? So Is that enough data, so to speak, to change their perception of Alabama right now? Probably not. So they wait like they did with Ohio State. The difference, though, where that comparison has to stop is Ohio State that year and Cardale Jones had the Big Ten championship game to really punctuate that playoff resume. Alabama, on the other hand, has Auburn, a 3-loss team right now. And with or without Tua in the lineup, they were on the outside looking in. So does it change their position? Not necessarily, but again, is Alabama a top 4 team with Mac Jones in the lineup? That's the question. That's what they have to figure out. And you can't close the door on them entirely because there are still a lot of things that can happen.
Let me pull back from the playoff view of Tua to just talk about what he has meant to Alabama and to college football. Because, I mean, it's a remarkable career when you think that this is a player who became maybe the face of the sport before he ever started a game. Like that one half against Georgia in the national championship game made him a massive star, and he had never started a game at that point. And to think how he transitioned and sort of changed Alabama, maybe in some ways the DNA of Alabama. Yes, the offense had already changed schematically because of Lane Kiffin, but what he turned Alabama into is something is just a very different type of team than it had been under Saban for the dynasty years. When you pull the lens back on Tua and think of his career, how do you put it in perspective?
It's really remarkable to be able to say, looking back, that he almost single-handedly changed the offense. What he has been able to do with spreading the ball all around the field, get rid of the I formation, throw to 4 or 5 different receivers, and just light up the scoreboard, right, so fast. And to be able to highlight so many of those receivers is one of the reasons at the start of this season we're talking about Alabama as a top 4 team in spite of a defense that has shown some vulnerabilities, in spite of a schedule that was absolutely nobody. Alabama was in the conversation because of Tua and his receivers, period. And I think Steve Young, one of our analysts, had a great quote. He said, basically, Tua had the ability to combine intuition and physical ability, right? And Steve Young called it, quote, the 3-dimensional chess in your head, which is perfect to summarize what he's able to do. So, and you're so right, Ralph, that when that happened, it's really felt callous to talk about anything but that poor kid and his family and the injury, and just you could see the pain on his face, and Molly McGrath's report on the sideline of him clearly, audibly hurting. But my goodness, I don't think that anybody or anything would take anything away from his legacy at Alabama, because he certainly has left his impact there.
Yeah, it's unfortunate. I mean, he may not have won the Heisman anyway, just because Joe Burrow has played so well. And not winning the Heisman is not necessarily something to be ashamed of, right? I mean, Deshaun Watson didn't win the Heisman. A lot of really great college players did not win the Heisman because other great college players stepped up in those seasons. I do wonder if, I hadn't even thought about this until I'm about to ask you the question. I hope he is a finalist. And I don't know if he will be. And I understand why people might, you only have 3 slots on your ballot. I don't vote. I don't know if you're a Heisman voter. I used to be, but there's a zillion Heisman voters. And you only have 3 spots on your ballot. So I could understand people saying, listen, I only have these 3. And here's a kid who didn't play a bunch of games. And yes, he's a terrific player, but do I really want to deny Chase Young, Justin Fields, Jalen Hurts, all these other incredibly deserving players? But I also could see the other argument saying, listen, this guy was absolutely heading towards being a finalist. He's a wonderful player who's had a wonderful career, and oh boy, I would really just like to see him be honored in that way and just going to New York. I don't know if you've given this any thought, and I don't know if you're a Heisman voter. I know that, again, there are a lot of them out there, but what are your thoughts on what you would do with a Heisman ballot and Tua?
Yeah, I am a Heisman voter, and I hadn't really thought about. And it's funny because
I'm sorry to drop it on you because I didn't text you this as a pre question, but it did just pop into my head as we're talking. So let's do this organically.
No, it's okay. It's okay because I think about the top 5 because I turn it into ESPN.com every Sunday night. We do kind of a Heisman watch, and I did not have him in there, but at the same time, I would consider everything that you're saying, just like CeeDee Lamb didn't play, and I had him down for the Blitnikoff, and I got to vote for that as well, too. So, to me, I think you have to take the whole body of work for this season, right? Not the career, but at the same time, everything he's done this season as well is impressive, too. And you look at what he did coming back from the first injury after the Arkansas game, and it was so impressive in the LSU game. Even in the loss in the second half, he was very good. So I don't know. I don't know what I'm going to do, but I would certainly consider it. I wouldn't say, no, I'm not going to put him one of those 3 slots because of the injury, but let's see what everybody else does, too.
A couple of weeks ago on the podcast, Brett McMurphy was on, a former ESPN colleague of yours, and we got into this conversation about how the Heisman would be better off expanding its ballot, going to top 5. Maybe you'd get more finalists and you'd open it up to more possibilities. And I think, again, the Heisman is very stodgy and very set in its ways, and I don't think is looking to necessarily redo anything of the way it's done. But I think this is another good example of why it might not be a terrible idea. It might be a damn good idea, in fact, for the Heisman to do that.
Yeah, I don't disagree. My biggest problem with the Heisman is that there are like 900 people voting for it. I don't understand that.
Yeah, a few less voters and a few more people to vote for. You're right. More players, less people voting. Probably would be a good formula for the Heisman, I think. Yeah,
we've got it all figured out, me and you.
All right, let's get into some of the other aspects of the playoff rankings. Again, they have not come out yet this week, but they're probably not going to change too much. Well, actually, let me start doing the scenario game with you here. And the number one scenario that seems to be sort of looming as this could be tricky, but then again, maybe it's not tricky. And that is Georgia wins out, beats LSU, an unbeaten LSU in the SEC title game. That creates a situation where it would be almost impossible or really hard to avoid putting 2 SEC teams in. Like, just that alone, I feel like could have some ramifications beyond just this year's playoff pairings, because there are possibilities that, the Pac-12 and the Big 12 and maybe even the Big 10 or the ACC, that somebody could be left out with a resume that typically would have gotten them in.
I agree, but that's the thing. I think it is not complicated if that were to happen, if that's the scenario. Excuse me, because I agree. I think it would be very hard for them to change exactly what we're looking at right now in the top 4, which is LSU, Ohio State, Clemson, and Georgia. I think what would happen is it would be Ohio State, Clemson, Georgia, LSU. And then you've got a lot of angry people on the outside looking in. But at the same time, if LSU follows the script and eliminates Georgia by handing it its second loss in the SEC championship game, then you're looking at all these one-loss teams. You go to the Power 5 conference champions, and then I think we have a great debate for that 4th spot. I think that could be interesting and very fun, but my gut says that it would be Oregon if they wind up winning the Pac-12 conference championship game. Could be Utah. Who knows? We could still be talking about 2 Big Ten teams. What if Alabama runs the table, beats Ohio State, beats Minnesota, avenges the regular season loss? I'd be shocked if they left out a 1-loss Penn State Big Ten champ, and then you have an 11-1 Ohio State sitting there.
Yeah, there are certainly enough games that will and a couple of them this weekend, especially that Penn State-Ohio State game. To a certain degree, I think everybody is sort of leaning that, Ohio State might be the best team in the country here, but they haven't quite played the schedule yet. I'm wondering where you fall on that, because I could see after this week, Ohio State was number one in the first rankings. LSU jumped them. LSU will almost likely be number one in the third. That hasn't come out yet. But I could also see the committee, not that it matters that much, flipping back to Ohio State if Ohio State treats Penn State the way it has treated all of its other opponents.
Yeah, that is going to be an interesting debate for number one, because those two teams can continue to flip-flop. My question, though, is how much value is there in a win against number 9 Penn State? It's a top-ranked team, right? But personally, my opinion is that I thought that Penn State was too high when they had them at number 4. And if you watch Penn State against Indiana this past weekend, which I did, I know KJ Hamler, their receiver, was out. That makes a difference. But you got to be able to run the ball. And I would be surprised if Ohio State doesn't beat Penn State this weekend by 2 touchdowns, at least.
Yeah. I kind of sense that might be coming too, frankly.
Yeah, right. So, I kind of feel like there's a reality to that. I'm just not sold on Penn State's offense. I think Sean Clifford has done a nice job. I just don't think he's spectacular. Whereas if you compare him to a Justin Herbert, I think what Justin has done is he's surrounded by more talent. The offensive line is great. They can run the ball very well, and he hasn't turned it over. He did last week, but I think all told he's got 3 picks maybe this year, 5. So I think that when you look at Penn State, I guess my question is it enough to boost them to number 1 over LSU? It might be, but I think that depends on your opinion of Penn State.
Okay, I want to do a U-turn here for a second, because I got away from a topic there that I wanted to expound on a little bit. And that is this idea that, because I think for the first time, especially if you have that Georgia-LSU scenario play out, for the first time since in a while, that I think all of the conferences could end up going, hey, what are you doing? We can't be left out. We have a legitimate argument here that you could end up with 5, not just because I think you always end up with 5 teams that could go, hey, what about us? Right? Mm-hmm. There's inevitably there will be at least one. I thought Ohio State had a reasonable argument. I didn't really think much of Georgia's argument, even though they were 6, even though they were 5. But I thought Ohio State at 6 had a pretty good argument last year. But I just think that's generally the way this thing is always going to work out, right? That last spot, there will always be another team that can raise its hand and say, we could have deserved that, and you know what? They probably could have. This year, if that Georgia-LSU thing plays out, and you have even Alabama sitting there, and you could have a situation where there might be 2 one-loss teams in the Big Ten. But even if that doesn't play out and Ohio State just rolls through everybody, and you have Oregon or Utah at 12-1, Oklahoma or Baylor at 12-1, that extra SEC team, do you see this as being something, that scenario, where now all of a sudden you have the Pac-12 and the Big 12 take a stance similar to what the Big Ten has taken, which has been a little more aggressive at pushing for expansion?
Yes, I could see that, because bubbling under the surface last year was more talk about it, not more action,
right?
More talk
no
amongst
doubt.
The commissioners.
And
right?
I don't know if there would be anything more than talk this year too, but we are getting closer to the end of the contract.
We are. And this summer I asked Bill Hancock how long it took to change from the BCS to the playoff, and he said 2 to 3 years. So you would imagine it would at least be 2 to 3 years to logistically change this system, right? So if that happened, and we're all at the national championship, all the commissioners are there, all the reporters are there, the selection committee's there, if they all decided this thing needs to be bigger, this isn't right, it would still take, we're talking about January 2020, 2 to 3 more years. And at this point, the bowl contracts are in through the length of this contract anyway. So while there might be a unanimous agreement by everyone to say, yep, it needs to change, too many teams were left out, I still don't think that you could actually make it happen until the end of this 12-year contract, just because of all of the strings attached to the bowl contracts, the Rose Bowl, the New Year's Six Bowls, all of that stuff is all tied in together, and you can't, even if you want to, you can't change it quickly.
Right. Even the dates, right? The dates for the games have been set, and
right.
The idea of working around. Now, that could be, and again, that's just a very small thing, but there are so many singular stumbling blocks that in and of themselves, all by themselves, seem like, oh, that's not that tough. You can figure that out. We've talked about this before, right? You can figure all these things out within a vacuum by themselves, but then you start stacking them all up, and all of a sudden it's as high as a building, right?
Right. I can't remember if it was you or Dennis Dodd, but somebody else wrote about this last year at this point. It might have been Schroeder. And, the description was you start to pull one string on the sweater and the whole thing comes unraveled. That is a perfect description of what would happen here.
So we're going to take a quick break, and we'll come back and we will get into some more scenarios, and maybe we'll look ahead a little bit and see where, again, some other places that this playoff race might be going. You are listening to the AP Top 25 College Football Podcast. I am talking with Heather Dinich from ESPN, and we will be back right after this.
This podcast is presented by Regions Bank. You're chasing your goals, and it's up to you how you want to get there. Let Regions Bank coach you with financial tips that fit your everyday grind. Visit regions.com/next-step to learn more. Regions, member FDIC.
And we're back on the AP Top 25 College Football Podcast. I'm talking with Heather Dinich, the playoff guru from ESPN. She does a great job covering all things CFP, and all things CFP have in some ways become all things college football. It's great for your gig, right? And it's honestly, I'm not just saying that for you, Heather, because I tell people this all the time. Like, I cover the sport from a national level. I'm not just the playoff reporter, but almost everything I do, I first think of through the lens of the playoff, because I think that's where most of the interest lies, especially for someone who looks at the sport from a national level. So there's things beyond that. But the guys saw some conversation this week on Twitter. I think one of the guys from SB Nation wrote an interesting article about, do we look too much through the playoff lens and miss other good stories that maybe in the past we would have embraced more? Are we too playoff focused in college football? And this is asking the person whose job is to cover the playoff.
I think it's a fair question, and I have spoken to some coaches who are concerned that the playoff has become all too consuming and that it's like basketball in the Final Four, and if you don't make it, it's a disappointing season when 10-2 is pretty darn good for a lot of teams. I can only speak for ESPN.com, and I feel like if you go there any day, any given day, you should be able to find one more really good story that's not about the playoff. And I think we've done a pretty good job of doing that. If you go there now, there's a really great story about Joshua Griffin at Colorado State, a walk-on who was an Iraq war veteran, right? And I think those are the kinds of stories that you have to continue to find and continue to tell. I'm working right now on the side on a really fun story about the Army-Navy rivalry game, and that's just something that I'm doing on the side, and it's taking a while, and there's a lot of calls, and I came back from the very first ranking from the college football playoff rankings in Dallas, and the next day I was in Annapolis on Navy's campus. So I think as you continue to do those things, it helps balance it out, but I do agree that it's all consuming. There's no question about it. I mean, all across all of our platforms, TV, radio, podcasts, whatever it might be, that's the driving force. And I think that a lot of it falls on reporters like us through across the country from coast to coast to continue to work hard to find and tell those stories. But I also think that that's part of our industry, too, is how our industry is changing and where are the venues and the forums and the platforms to continue to tell those great stories so that people can find them.
Right. And I just I'm not doing this because I feel I need to defend you and ESPN. But again, I don't work for ESPN and I take a similar approach, right? We know we are friends with the national college football writers from many different outlets. Mm-hmm. And we don't have any ownership within the playoff like ESPN does, because people will say, well, ESPN owns the playoff, so of course it has to cover it that way. But I don't have any ownership in the playoff, but I still think that playoff first. And I think where it becomes tricky is, college football is still very much a regional sport. And you look at a story like Minnesota having this amazing year where it could possibly be in the Rose Bowl. Minnesota in the Rose Bowl is a big damn deal. Like, Minnesota hasn't been in the Rose Bowl since 1962. Like, Indiana possibly getting to, 8 or 9 wins?
Right.
Is a huge deal. Baylor, regardless of what happens with the Big 12 race, Baylor being turned around by Matt Rule and 3 years after it hit rock bottom, possibly winning 9 or 10 games, is such a fascinating story. And I think on a regional level, they are probably still big stories. But I wonder if on a national level we sort of lose track of them because we're always trying to wedge them into the playoff discussion. And that's where I think that I think, again, and that's not necessarily, I think, something that is a journalism problem as much as I think it's just a shifting of the sport in a way that this is evolution. I think this is the evolution of the sport. But I also wonder how much, if we went to Minnesota right now and really talk to Minnesota fans, most of them would be like, if we make the playoff, that's fine. But this has been awesome anyway.
Right. No, you are 100% spot on. I agree with you wholeheartedly. And I do that too. We talk about Minnesota and I talk about it through the lens of the playoff. And I always preface it with, well, this is really great and program changing for Minnesota, but, right? And there's not enough emphasis on the former and it's too much on the latter. This is what it does for them in the playoff, right? But you're right. And Baylor, we just gloss over them. I do anyway. I gloss over Baylor because I look at it through their strength of schedule. I look at it through double overtime against Texas Tech and triple overtime against TCU, blah, blah, blah. Well, guess what? Baylor's really happy. They're having a great season.
Yeah, I think it also speaks to the idea that really a lot of us clamored for a playoff, a lot of fans and a lot of media. I wouldn't necessarily mind seeing it get bigger. But it does come with a little bit of a cost, and part of that cost is we have devalued the bowls. But even that, to a certain degree, because people will look at some of these I don't even know how many tiers you want to create of bowls. I tend to break them down into 3 tiers, but really there could be 4th tier.
Right.
But nonetheless, it doesn't matter if it's the New Mexico Bowl or the Citrus Bowl or even maybe the Rose Bowl, right? It's almost about what team, if you're New Mexico State and you had one bowl game in your history, and I believe it was last year or the year before, make a bowl game, that's a big deal and a cool story. But if I'm Ohio State and I go to the Rose Bowl this year, well, unfortunately, that's kind of a bummer for a lot of Ohio State fans. So it's just changed the way we look at college football. But really, it's only changed the way we look at college football because I think what we have discovered is there is such a very small amount of teams that really have a chance to win the national championship. And that's always been the case, but I think the playoff has heightened the perception of that.
Right. Yeah. No, that makes sense. And, the coaches I talked to, I can't remember who it was. It was one of the Big Ten coaches, but we were talking about this, and he was like, we went to the Rose Bowl. He was like, we weren't in the playoff, but we were in the Rose Bowl. That means something. It should mean something. It should still mean something. But, you're right. It depends on who you are and what your goals are. And to be the head coach and have to look at your team and be like, guys, we're not in the top 4, but we're still a really good football team, and convince them of that and make sure they know that the season is not a disappointment.
How much do you think the conversation we're having plays into the whether you should expand the playoff? Because think about it from this perspective. If I only believe that there are 3 or 4 teams that can truly win the national championship every year, maybe there are 5. Maybe in a good year you can make a case for a 5th, right? Then why expand the playoff?
Because conference champions are getting left out, and that's what drives people insane. And I agree with what you're saying. If there's only probably 4 or 5 teams that can get in, why have it bigger than 4 or 5? But the commissioners, that's their concern, is that everything else gets devalued even more than what we're talking about right now, the bowls and the regular season. And I've never thought that the argument is about who won it or who got in. The argument has always been about who's been left out, who didn't have a chance to at least try for it. And I think that's the dividing line, right? But at the same time, you have to question, do you want automatic qualifiers in if there's a 3-loss conference champion? I mean, if Clemson were to lose in the ACC championship game, do you want to see Virginia or Pitt? I don't even know who's in the Coastal Division going to win that thing. I mean, is that what you want to see in your playoff? I don't think so. Like last year, if Northwestern would have won, is that who you want to see in the playoff? Probably not. So if you open that door, you open it to those possibilities as well, and I think that's what the commissioners wanted to stay away from.
Well, but I would suggest, though, it's a matter of do you want to see it or who has earned it in some fashion. I think that's one of the reasons why it becomes tricky, right? The whole expansion thing becomes tricky because I think a lot of it, what you see from folks is just a frustration with the subjectivity, and it's just not the way we follow sports, right? We have talked about this, like the general way you follow traditional sports is you like a bunch of teams compete for something, a bunch of those teams, decide who is best, and then that team moves on to something else, right? So we look at college sports that way and think, well, the SEC will determine who is best of that team, of that group of teams, and they will move on to compete on with a different set of teams for another prize. That's like a very logical way of following sports. But it's just not that way in college football, and it doesn't really work there. Like that model doesn't fit college football comfortably. So I understand why you'd push back against it, but I think that the subjectivity frustrates a lot of folks, and I think there are some people who would say, listen, I know that team went 9-4, but at least we didn't get a bunch of people in a room pick that team. That there was a process by which that team had to earn its way in, and maybe it's not as good as some other team, but it did follow the rules and get in that way. Right.
I mean, look, we can have a whole other podcast about changing the entire way this whole thing works because I mean, at the end of the day, the divisions aren't equal. The conference games aren't equal. If you think about it,
everything is unequal.
Right. It's silly, right? Yeah. 8 games, 9 games. I mean, FCS, no FCS, whatever you want to do with it. And then, some East versus West, they don't have to play this team. Why do we have to play that team? Like, all of that stuff is not logical for truly determining who the best teams are. You can't even determine who the best teams are in your conference if you're outside the Big 12.
Right. And that's, another fascinating thing, if and when this thing does expand, will be what the conference's reactions to determining their champions. I don't know if you trash conference championship games because those have a lot of value as far as literal monetary value. But if all of a sudden everybody sort of blows up their divisions and comes up with some kind of pods or just forget divisions overall, we're just going to match up the top 2 teams here. I think that will be an interesting piece of the next step of the playoff, which I think inevitably will be expansion. But where it trickles down as far as within conferences and within bowls, I think will be fascinating to me.
Yep, I agree. It's inevitable at some point, but I just don't know when. Not anytime soon.
Okay.
Let's say that. That's a safe prediction, I feel.
Yeah. If soon is before that contract ends, then no. If you define that as soon, I'm in for the not anytime soon. Before I let you go, another question that I didn't prep you for, but I'm gonna give you a little time. I'll filibuster here, and maybe you've already looked into this. I want you to look over the next couple of weeks. Is there a game or two? Because what could really upset the apple cart here is a true upset. Right? A true upset where a team that is not in the race beats a team that is in the race. And when I say in the race, even in the top 15 or so, right? Teams like Baylor and Penn State and Minnesota, where if not one of those teams, do you see a game or two down the stretch here where you say, you know what? That could be an upset there. That could be a game that sort of changes things because it's a quote unquote bad loss, and it changes who plays in a conference championship game, where the dynamic of this race changes in some way drastically, but for a game that maybe is a little off the radar. Where's the upsets?
I think there are a lot. I think you could start this week with Georgia, Texas A&M. They can't lose that game. If they lose that game and then they go on to win the SEC, you got a 2-loss SEC champ in Georgia, the loss to South Carolina and A&M.
Yeah, that's a messy situation. That's a messy scenario too, by the way.
Yeah. There's that, and then there's what happens if Clemson loses South Carolina, which they should not. But hey, guess what? Georgia did. Who knows? It's their in-state rival. It's the last game of the season. I would not pick South Carolina in that game, but that's why they call it an upset, right? Anybody in the Pac-12. If Utah or Oregon loses before they get to the Pac-12 championship, that's a game changer, because if a 2-loss Pac-12 champ then opens the door for Oklahoma, opens the door for Alabama, opens the door for a second Big Ten team. Excuse me, who knows? But I think those are three that come to my head immediately.
Yeah, it should be fun, and I also have my eye on Texas. If that Texas A&M game was in College Station as opposed to Georgia this weekend, and Georgia was in the second part of back-to-back road games, a long trip at an A&M team where College Station could be a dicey place to play, even though they haven't really shown. They've already played Clemson, they've already played Alabama, and they're probably going to play. They could possibly play number 1 LSU. They would, by the way, if LSU remains number 1 in the AP poll when it plays Texas A&M, Texas A&M would become the first team in the history of the AP poll to have played number 1 3 times in the same season.
Oh my gosh!
Yeah, so it's a brutal possible schedule, but I do think that the Georgia game could have been an interesting one, or a more interesting one, if it was in College Station this week. They haven't played particularly competitive against Alabama or Clemson, but I kind of think that they might have one really good game left in them. Right.
Yeah, they're kind of tricky. I just don't know. I don't know. But if there was an upset this week, that's the one that I would pick.
Yeah, and maybe they have it in them when LSU comes to town, because that will be in College Station. LSU's defense has been a little wonky, and that will be the very last. This will be the very last question, and then I will let you go. Because I get this question. I'm sure you've gotten this question too. LSU's defense isn't very good, and it always seems like the committee has held that against some of these Big 12 teams. Do you think that they should start holding it against LSU, or do you think they will start holding it against LSU? And I'm not going to dive into the numbers and compare the two. LSU's defense has shown itself to be a little wonky.
Yes, fair. And they have called out Oklahoma's defense specifically. Now, granted, Rob Mullins was asked about it last week, but he specifically said Oklahoma's defense has taken a step back. That's one of the reasons that they haven't been too impressed with them. But, I mean, it's not that bad, but I feel like if you watch the Ole Miss game, you're like, oh, they gave up 37 points. They gave up 41 points to Alabama. It has
400 yards rushing against Ole Miss. 400 yards rushing.
Right. Yeah, no, I think it's fair, but because of who have played, Florida, Auburn, Alabama, I think that helps outweigh it, the fact that they've won those games. But Ohio State's defense, man, that's one of those things, those little things in the end on Selection Day that can make that flip. They pay attention to it. Absolutely, they pay attention to it, and that can make them that could flip it.
Heather Dinich is the great playoff reporter for ESPN, the guru of the playoff, all things playoff all the time.
Checks in the mail. You can't say that without laughing. Stop.
Hey, thanks for doing this, Heather. Good luck the rest of the way. A happy Thanksgiving, since we're only, it's awfully close to Thanksgiving.
It is. Same to you, my friend. Thank you for having me on.
Yeah, and pleasure, and hopefully we will run into each other in a press box real soon.
Sounds good. Thanks, Ralph.
And now, 3 and out. First down. I have a few thoughts about Tua, college football, and the NFL. The NCAA draws a lot of fire for its amateurism rules and prohibiting players from making money off what is clearly a very valuable skill. There is no doubt that these players, all of them, have some monetary value. I'll go back to the example I use all the time. If we magically made it legal, NCAA legal, for all teams to hand out $1 million worth of bonus money to their signing classes, distributed however the team decides, how much money do you think would be left over? The answer, of course, is not a dime. Every FBS team would use that money to lure the best players they can, and a 3-star that is no big deal to an SEC school would be a huge addition to a Conference USA school. But I digress. College football wants to be college football, not pro football. I really don't have a problem with that. The bigger issue is the NFL taking no responsibility in developing its own players, the way other sports do, and arbitrarily setting a requirement of 3 years removed from high school for a player to be drafted. Other sports draft players that are not physically ready to compete at the highest level, but they draft on projectability and have some kind of minor league system set up to develop those players. Or they have roster construction set up in a way that those players could be developed at the highest level without exposing them to a lot of important game competition. Why can't the NFL do this? Because you can tell me that Trevor Lawrence and Tua weren't ready to play in the NFL this year, but if they were available to be drafted last year, they would have been among the first players, certainly among the first quarterbacks taken, solely on projectability. Think back to the days not long ago when NBA teams were drafting high school players. Plenty of them needed time to develop, like Kobe Bryant and Kevin Garnett, but teams were still selecting them very high in the draft because they understood the upside outweighed waiting a couple of years for them to develop. The NFL could do this if it chose. It could expand rosters. It could expand the draft. It could expand coaching staffs to work with practice squad players. Maybe it could create a D-League. The money is there for all of this, but why buy the milk when you can get the cow for free? Second down. I had this weird 24-hour period last weekend where I convinced myself Georgia was the best team in the SEC and was totally going to beat LSU in the league championship game and force its way into the playoff. And then talked myself out of that and decided, nope, this Georgia offense is just not doing it for me. Heather and I talked about LSU's shaky defense, but I asked this. Does Georgia do anything offensively that teams like Alabama and Ole Miss do to stress a defense? Any of you who have listened to me know I am firmly in the camp that great offenses in college football have a big advantage even over great defenses. I would never go into a game thinking an opponent is going to hold LSU down. Auburn did a pretty good job of that, but even the Tigers needed some LSU turnovers and missteps in the red zone to keep LSU in check. I am back on the LSU bandwagon, so to speak, and still wondering what exactly is Georgia doing or not doing with that offense. Third down. Off the radar this week, it's the time of year when a whole bunch of teams are scrambling to get bowl eligible, 6 wins. The folks who do a really good job of projecting this stuff, guys like Stuart Mandel of The Athletic, Brett McMurphy of Stadium, just to name 2, are forecasting enough 6-6 teams to fill all 78 spots, maybe even 1 or 2 extra. The Pac-12 has more than half of its teams still trying to get there. Among them, Oregon State and Washington State. Both are sitting at 5-5 heading into their game Saturday at Pullman. Both have another game left against their in-state rivals. Both teams will be big underdogs in those rivalry games. So this is a big one for the Beavers and the Cougars. Can Oregon State reach bowl eligibility for the first time since 2013? It'd be quite an achievement in the second year for Coach Jonathan Smith. Meanwhile, 2014 was the last time Wazoo did not go to a bowl game under Coach Mike Leach. That's the show for today. I'd like to thank my producer, Warren Levinson, for making me sound good. You can find this podcast at Apple Podcasts, on Westwood One Podcast, just about anywhere you like to get your podcasts. Please subscribe so you don't miss an episode. I'm Ralph Russo, the college football writer with the Associated Press. Thanks for listening, and come back for more next week of the AP Top 25 College Football Podcast.
This podcast is presented by Regions Bank. You're chasing your goals, and it's up to you how you want to get there. Let Regions Bank coach you with financial tips that fit your everyday grind. Visit regions.com/next-step to learn more. Regions, member FDIC.